if you say it, if you talk to Churchill, I said no. Churchill was for the maintenance of the empires.
Well, you might say that. Might be worth saying, even though you didn't hear him say it. Okay?
Well, why not say Churchill was not in sympathy in breaking up the empires?
Okay. We'll say it any way you want. You ready? Okay, we're rolling now.
Okay.
Governor Harriman, you were close to President Roosevelt during World War II. What was his attitude toward the future of Indochina?
Well, I talked to President Roosevelt several, or rather, I was present when President Roosevelt talked about Indochina on several occasions, and one of the most dramatic was when he talked to Stalin about it at Tehran. He indicated that he didn't think the French should be allowed to go back into Indochina, and Stalin heartily approved of that. And then Roosevelt suggested that there be a trusteeship of the United Nations. Stalin didn't comment on that. He did, however, at Tehran agree to the United Nations, which is a great breakthrough. But on other occasions, he mentioned the fact he thought the French had done nothing for the Indochinese and that they shouldn't be allowed to go back. In fact, he sent word to the Pentagon. Hank Byrode, Colonel Byrode, who was in the Army and then later on ambassador, told me that he had been a staff officer and he saw a message come from Roosevelt to the Army that they should not have anything to do with the surrender of the Japanese in Indochina. But he never left any word with the State Department, so no one understood just what his ideas were.
What do you think Churchill's attitude was towards the situation in Indochina?
Well, he didn't talk with Churchill about it because, of course, Churchill had made it very plain he wasn't for a forced breakup of the empires. His views wouldn't have fitted in. But this was an understanding between Roosevelt and Stalin.
You were the head of the Marshall Plan in Europe during the early 1950s. At that time, we were giving aid to France, and France was fighting in Indochina. Were the French diverting American economic aid to Indochina?
Well, they were diverting their aid. I was in Paris, 48 through mid-50 until we had the Korean War, and I came back as an special assistant to President Truman. But I was quite unhappy about the fact that much of the aid that we were giving France was diverted towards this war in Indochina, and knowing the Roosevelt position and having accepted that as wise, I took up with Atchison, who was then Secretary of State, that we should, I think it must have been 49, that we ought to slow down on helping the French and get them to reduce their commitments there. And I got a word back, I think one of the few rude telegrams I ever got from the State Department. They said, your job is in Europe, not in the Far East. Well, the facts were that Atchison didn't know anything about the Far East, or very little. He was trying to butter up the French at that time to get them to accept an arrangement by which the Germans could enter into the defense of Europe. And he wanted to get their goodwill, and he didn't want to raise this issue. So I was against this war as far back as, on the record, as far back as 49.
What was President Truman's attitude towards the French war in Indochina?
Well, immediately after the attack in Korea, he wanted to strengthen all the situations because he didn't know who was back of this. He thought the Chinese might be, and he didn't step up, but I think he accelerated the aid to the French in Indochina, and we sent a liaison officer out there to make sure that there were no difficulties but with the Chinese attacking. He also ordered the 7th Fleet to see that there was no fighting either way and he asked Chiang Kai-shek not to have any raids on China. He wanted to protect all the world flanks against possible action on the part of China.
Did you approve of President Truman's decision to send an American military mission to Indochina at the time?
Well, it wasn't a mission, it was a liaison. Of course it was, because we were trying to do everything we could to protect against the Chinese becoming involved in the activities. And it had nothing to do with Indochina, it had to do with our problem, that the war we were having in Korea.
Could you, looking back on the Eisenhower administration's policy towards East Asia, what was your opinion of it? You were not in the administration, of course, but what was your view of it?
Oh, I was very strongly for President Eisenhower's opposition to what the three men, Nixon, Dulles, and Admiral Radford, wanted to intervene, even to the point of discussing use of nuclear bombs before Dien Bien Phu, and Eisenhower put a stop to that. He had Matt Ridgway as his advisor, and Matt Ridgway was very strongly against getting involved in the Asian continent with American troops. And I thought Eisenhower's decision at that time against his three strong advisors was very wise.
Did you ever discuss the situation in Asia with Eisenhower?
No, never did at all.
What about the move by the Eisenhower administration and Secretary of State Dulles to install Nodine Diem as the head of the government in Saigon? What did you think of that?
Well, I don't know that he installed it, but what he did do, which I was opposed to, he took over the responsibility which the French had for South Vietnam. And General Ely was there and attempting to deal with the situation, and we found Diem. I think he found Diem then and supported him. And I think General Collins made a report indicating that he thought it was not a very good thing to do. But Dulles went ahead anyway, and that was the start of all the trouble. If we hadn't intervened in South Vietnam at that time and taken political, economic, and military responsibility for Diem, it would have avoided all of the difficulties in the future.
Well, could I ask you...
And that was the beginning, and I was opposed to it then, but when Kennedy came in, of course, he inherited the situation, and it was quite different inheriting a situation than the beginning responsibilities for
Well, looking back, as
Saigon.
maybe as a historian, what did you think might have been the alternative to our getting involved in South Vietnam as back as 1954?
Well, I think we could have stayed out of South Vietnam. We could have stayed out of Vietnam. You know, Ho Chi Minh was anybody that knew history knew that Ho Chi Minh was rather an Asian type of Titoist. He didn't want to be dominated by anyone way back in Wilson's day. And we had advisors with him during the war. They were quite friendly to America. And I had gotten all that information during the war. And I looked upon Ho Chi Minh not as a part of the normal communist expansionist, but I looked upon him as a man that was a Vietnamese patriot, and therefore I had no, I really didn't have any great feeling that we should get involved at that time in Vietnam. Now, if the French wanted to continue to support Diem or anybody else in South Vietnam that they chose, that was their affair. And of course, we were helping the French, and it was one thing to help the French, and quite another thing to take direct responsibility.
Governor, now we're going to jump up to the period of 1968 that we want to do because Dan is here.
That's right.
So I'm going to jump ahead here.
Hold on until the paper stops right on. Sean, what's the standing print on the right?
That's good.
Okay.
All right. In the spring of 1968, you became the president's chief negotiator at the peace talks in Paris. What was it like negotiating with the Vietnamese?
Well, I want to say that I was the chief negotiator, but Cy Vance was my partner, and we worked together as a team. He was, and everything we did together. And I've never had a more satisfactory relationship with him. But the discussions were very long, drawn out, were very frustrating. We required fantastic patience, and there were two sets of discussions. Do you want me to go into the detail?
Yeah, if you would, yeah.
What they were like? We had the plenary sessions, which were formal, and they were only between the North Vietnamese representative, Swan Thuy was his name, and myself. I or he would start off with a statement, and each one of us would accuse the other of being the aggressor and of doing very cruel and unnecessary and damaging actions, and then the other side would answer. We would always have a little, after one had made a speech, the other side would criticize briefly what the first man had said, and then the second man would make his speech, and then the first man would criticize the other man. The South Vietnamese, oddly enough, used to criticize my criticism of his speech, so it turned out that he always had the last word. I didn't undignify myself to a point of doing that, so I used to say, I always give you the last word. These amounted to nothing. They didn't get anywhere. They were tried to make a little variety in them by getting news stories or stories of what some prominent man had said, or they'd try to get some senator statement or something else from the United States, and I'd try to get some statement from other international sources. But then we began to have tea breaks between the two speeches, coffee breaks rather, and those coffee breaks, Swan Thuy and Averell used to sit down with us, and with Vance and myself, and I think Phil Habib, and we'd talk, and then the military would get together, and our staffs would get together. There would be 3 or 4 different groups would get together and drink coffee, and we'd talk for about half an hour. And that began to loosen our personal relationships. We talked about things of special interest. And then the first real change came when Cy Vance arranged with Averell to have private talks, and they went to a private arranged house. Sometimes it was theirs, sometimes it was ours, and began to talk about things in a private way. But I want to say that from the standpoint of Washington, we had a great deal of difficulty I think it was the 8th of June, 1968. There was a telegram that came from Chairman Kosygin to President Johnson, and he said, this was one of the phrases he used, "I and my colleagues believe, and we have reason to believe, that if you will stop all the bombing, productive talks will follow." Cy and I came back from Bobby Kennedy's funeral, which was, I think it was June 10th, thereabouts. So we were in Washington when this telegram was being considered. We sent word from Paris that we'd like to discuss it. And we talked it over with Rusk and with Clark Clifford, who was then Secretary of Defense, and we strongly urged that it be accepted. We thought that it was a very good idea because that the Russians should be involved, and I had found in other dealings and earlier dealings that the Russians were anxious to see the war stop. But there was a meeting with the president, and Dean Rusk took the point of view that we didn't know, and I think after talking to the president, that we didn't know enough about what was involved, and Clark Clifford indicated that he thought we ought to accept it, and Vance and I indicated we ought to accept it. But the president decided that he ought to have more information, and Abe Fortas, who was then Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, I think, and he was there at the meeting. He and Dean Rusk drafted a telegram which you couldn't take exception to because it asked sensible questions. And although we were very much opposed to it, there was nothing we could do. So this telegram was sent, and Kosygin obviously took it as an insult that he didn't accept their word, and that opportunity was lost. And I think that was the loss of a very, very great opportunity. I think if we'd stopped all the bombing at that time, we would have gotten down to talks. And I think with the relationship which we were beginning to establish at that time, we might have made some very real progress, as was shown by our later talks. Then,
Excuse me, do you recall anything, any details of that telegram that was sent back to Kosygin?
I'm telling you what the detail was. The detail was asking questions. What did he mean? What did he think would happen? Just what did he do? That was the general talk about it. It was a carefully drawn, legalistic question. It was legalistic in its relationship, not in terms of the human emotions that were back of all this. Then there was a lull in the fighting, and the end of June, early July, and Vance and I sent a telegram in July, again, I guess it was in July, saying that we thought that the signal had been given us, that they were ready to reduce the fighting because of the lull in the fighting, and we urged that we stop all the bombing. That was just before the Democratic National Committee meeting. I think, of course, if that had happened, there had been no row. If either of those things had been accepted, there had been no row in the Democratic Party, and Hubert would have been acclaimed, and we would have undoubtedly, I think, would have won the election. But Johnson was afraid he'd be considered a political move, and I think turned it down because of political moves. So that those two opportunities were lost. But then we went on with our talks, and there was a senior member of the Politburo from Hanoi that came there called Le Docteur. He was fifth or sixth in rank in the hierarchy, and he joined our talks. And we began to have, Vance and I began to have private talks with him and Swan Tree. And in September, I think September 7th, we used to have 1 or 2 meetings a week in the plenary sessions. Well, we used to have about 2 or 3 in the beginning, and then we reduced it to, I think, to 1, and then we have a couple of private talks. Nobody knew those private talks. They never got in the press, and we concealed them. Some of them were very long. One of them lasted 9 hours. But we finally found a breakthrough in our relationship by these private talks. You remember the North Vietnamese were demanding it wouldn't change when any iota that the United States should stop the bombing and all other hostile acts against the North Vietnam unconditionally. But then they indicated that first they said it would, and later on, as I've explained, they put the word will, prompt, and some language, I've forgotten the detail. I think they used several different kinds of language, but prompt and serious talks would be undertaken. And we said, now we're not going to talk about the unconditional stopping of the United States bombing and all acts of war against you, but we have a right to know the circumstances and the conditions which would which would surround these talks. I think they used one time productive talks, serious talks, and we wanted to get a definite. We asked, and they accepted the fact that it was reasonable for us to ask the question of what the circumstances would be, what the position of the situation would be, in order to have these talks productive or serious. And we took the strong position with authority from Washington. There should be no fighting around and through the DMZ, and no attacks on Saigon and the big cities. We didn't think there could be productive talks when there were conversations of that kind. And we also insisted that the government of South Vietnam be present.
Governor, as you saw it at the time, what was the real policy of the United States? What did we really want in Vietnam?
Well, at the end there, the president wanted to get the talk started. And in these October talks, he showed every disposition of wanting to get the talk starting. And we had some very long talks. They wanted to talk of every detail, and we thought we had an agreement, and then they wanted to have an agreed-upon minute, and it was very difficult for us to have an agreed-upon minute, and we'd argue about it.
What was our objective?
But we got, what?
What was our ultimate objective? Did we want to have...
We wanted to have, what we insisted on is that there should be no fighting in and around or across the DMZ, or no attacks on the big cities, and that the government of South Vietnam should be present at the talks. And they agreed to that. And finally, but on the other hand, then the South Vietnamese government, President Thieu, began to make trouble. And it seemed very obvious that he was trying to delay the talks, the end of the bombing in these talks, until after the election. The story is Madame Chenault, but if it wasn't Madame Chenault, it was the ambassador here, sent word to Saigon that they'd have a better chance to have the war continue with Nixon than with Humphrey. And I'm satisfied they delayed us in and put in roadblocks. And so finally, President Johnson, on the 31st of December, ordered the stopping of all the bombing to take effect the 1st of November. And this was done without the approval of Thieu. And that was so close to the election, however, that it had some effect, but nothing like the effect it would have had if we had come to that agreement, which I think we probably would have a week earlier if it hadn't been for the intervention of the South Vietnamese. And we could have sat down then and had serious talks. Now, after that, when Nixon was elected, we had all this difficulty about the shape of the table. I'll tell you about that if you want to.
Go ahead.
Well, the whole argument over the period had been what was the relationship between the four parties which would take part in the final peace discussions. That would be the GVN, ourselves, the South Vietnamese government on our side, and the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which was the VC as we called them, on the other. So we got the idea of calling it our side, your side. They wanted to call it a four-party conference because they wanted to build up the NLF. And we didn't want to recognize them as a government, and these were government talks. We couldn't recognize them as a government, and we had a great deal of difficulty. We wanted to have a two-sided table, and they wanted to have a round table. And the South Vietnamese were very strong for this. But we were ready to accept a round table on the basis that people sitting at the table didn't have any position, but they said that if it was a round table, each one were equal, and they wouldn't stand for it. So we had an endless discussion about whether it should be a round table or an oval table or a two-sided table. And the issue was the recognition of the status of the NLF. People made fun of it, but it wasn't. It was a very major issue, particularly for the South Vietnamese. And the interesting thing was that the Russian embassy helped us all through this period. They helped us get some of these decisions. There was a deputy to the ambassador by the name of Obarenko, a great big square Russian. And he really dealt very toughly with the North Vietnamese when he thought they were making a mistake. And he was the one that finally broke the ice. We agreed on having 2 half round tables with a space between them. And the question was how wide that space would be. And I think someone suggested that it'd be big enough for Mr. Obarenko to go through, but Mr. Obarenko was a great big fellow, so it was quite a little space. And then there were 2 tables to be opposite each other, these open spaces with papers on it, so as to make it look as little as possible as a division. But on that basis, we agreed, and it was on that basis that we left it for the Nixon administration in January to take over, with an agreement reached that these 4 parties should start peace negotiations. But we never had any talks that time, because I think in that period the South Vietnamese were stalling, and part of their urge to make this fuss about this table was to delay the all action until the Nixon administration took over. So we never had a serious talk. We never were able to get down to it. I was naturally, and so was Sy, very keen to find out what their attitude was. And as I've explained with other questions, we had some inkling of some of their thoughts.
Just to go back to a question I asked before, in your mind, what did President Johnson want? Did he want to have, was he willing to have a neutral South Vietnam, or what was his ultimate objective?
We never knew. We never discussed that. But he was ready to have a settlement, and I'm satisfied that everyone realized that there had to be some sort of a neutral Laos. But as I've told you in answer to other questions, there was indication that the North Vietnamese would have accepted the DMZ and given the South Vietnam a chance to develop itself. I know in Algeria, where they had quite a big delegation, the North Vietnamese, the Algerians told me that they spoke of the fact that there was no hurry in the merging of the North and the South. That might take 5 years, even 10 years to happen. No one quite knows. As far as I was concerned, I wanted to see the South Vietnamese people have a chance, have a political chance. They weren't being able to. The military situation wasn't satisfactory, and I wanted to see them have a political chance. So I was rather for personally for a neutral Laos. I've told you in so many of the questions that you've asked me before about the different indications that I'd had in this situation. So these questions have been answered before.
How did you find the Vietnamese as people when you were in these private sessions as individuals? What kind of impression did they make on you?
Well, they were human beings, very tough, very determined. They wanted to be very independent. As I've told you, the Russians wanted to see the war over, but the Chinese wanted to see it continued. They were under some influence from the Chinese, but they wanted to be independent of the Chinese. They wanted to be independent of everybody. Ho Chi Minh is the closest thing to an Asian type of Titoist as existed, and He wanted to be independent. Now, we got talking about all their problems and all sorts of things. They got very interested in the kinds of things that we would bring up, like the miracle rice and miracle wheat, which would grow very much more. And I said, if we can only get to peace, we can work together for this, how much better it would be to work together for peaceful. And they were human beings. They wanted to see their country develop. But they were very strong communists, very strong in the development of the life of North Vietnam independently of Chinese domination.
Governor, before the peace talks started in Paris, you engaged in various peace missions for the Johnson administration. Which was the one that you considered the most serious?
Well, I think one of the most serious in the attempts to get the peace negotiation going was undertaken by the Romanians in 1967. I had gone to Pakistan for the opening of one of the great dams on the Indus River, and I came back and stopped at saw Tito, and then I went to Romania. I went there because the Prime Minister of Romania, Mr. Maura, had been to Hanoi and wanted to find out what he had to say. They treated me very well. They gave me a private house to live in and my party, and we had a couple of days of real solid talks. And there was a deputy foreign minister who really took a lot of, Markov Vescu was his name. He took very special interest in this. I saw him, incidentally, Mr. Ceausescu, who gave me quite a scolding over the war. He felt we were absolutely wrong in the war, but was ready to help us get out. And they sent Markovescu to Hanoi twice. They sent him once to find out about the situation, and they came to see us. Came to see me in Washington, and that really, I think, got down to December 1967. And well, he came first earlier than that, in November, I think, and then went back. And he was one of the best negotiators I've ever dealt with. He was very fair and very straight. He told me the difficulties as well as the good points. And he was one of those that carried the message that they had changed the words. If we stopped all the bombing and all other hostilities, discussions might take place, discussions will take place. But he was not successful because we did not stop the bombing, and unfortunately while he was there was some heavy bombing, and he finally had to admit that he was not able to get an agreement. But I think he did a lot of good, and I think his work there contributed. He was one of the most useful of those that negotiated in persuading them that they ought to start talks, and I think he may well have had some influence on the Hanoi to accept the Johnson proposal, which he made in that famous speech in March when he announced that he wasn't going to run for the presidency. Said he'd stop the bombing in the northern part and only limit it to the bombing of the neck. And I didn't think they'd accept that, but they did accept that. So I was very grateful to him for that. I was very grateful for the Romanians for that. And of course, as I've explained before, I was very grateful to the Poles for what they did.
Governor, when one looks back on that whole period of your search for settlement and peace in Vietnam, sometimes there were periods when you were negotiating and when stopping the bombing was crucial to the negotiations, and yet the bombing was not stopped. Was there a lack of coordination here in the administration in Washington?
Well, that gets into one of the other questions which you've already asked me.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. That question gets into one of the other questions that you have already asked me.
Well, I just want...
That gets into the Marigold question.
Oh, I see. Okay. You want to go back and
I thought we'd agreed to,
to do that later?
but I thought you just asked a question about Humphrey.
Oh, yeah, okay. Let's ask that one. Do you think that Hubert Humphrey would have withdrawn from Vietnam had he been elected?
I'm absolutely certain that he would have. I remember making a talk in Atlanta on the television, and he followed me when I was down there making a speech, and we both were on the local television, and I said I was satisfied that Humphrey would have appointed either Ball or Clark, and Secretary of State, and would have gotten out of that. Both of them were opposed to the war and would have gotten out of the war. And he said that I was inaccurate. He'd made up his mind he was going to appoint Clark Clifford. And you know, Clark Clifford was very firm and definite. And he was going to ask Cy Vance to be Secretary of Defense and leave me in Paris. And the three of us were determined to get out. I think we could have had a responsible settlement when we had 500,000 troops. I thought the idea would develop that we could make a settlement after we'd taken all of our troops out. Just didn't make any sense. And as you know, the Nixon administration continued the war for 3 years, and 40% of our men killed were killed under that period. And we tried to make a settlement after we supposedly had Vietnamized the war. The time to have made the settlement was when we had the 500,000 troops there. And I'm satisfied that we could have made a deal of some kind, and I know that Clark was determined to get out, and Humphrey told me that he picked him because of his skill and determination to get out of the war. So there's no question in my mind that Humphrey would have gotten out of the war in '69 if he would have been there on some basis. What basis, I can't tell. I've always wanted to, I never spoke about an honorable settlement because there was no honor in the situation, but I wanted to see a responsible settlement, which I personally thought was some sort of a neutral South Vietnam, independent for a period of years, and then we would have to leave it to the future to decide what happened. The important thing was to give the people that we'd been supporting a political opportunity. They hadn't had a military, we were going to take away the military operation because it was not successful, but give them a political opportunity.
Did President Johnson resent Humphrey's attitude toward the war?
Well, I think he did, but Humphrey was rather cautious during the campaign, rather more cautious than I hoped he would be. I was thinking about resigning and coming back and trying to help him, but then when George Ball resigned, I thought I was more use in Paris, which I think showed it was. We could have stopped the bombing and started the negotiations, which we could have done if we'd had some cooperation from the South Vietnamese government. But Johnson was always, remember the Salt Lake speech, which was rather mild, he was always afraid that Humphrey would say something which was adverse to the position he'd taken. And in the camp, remember he forced the vote in the convention in August 1968. There had been an agreement reached, I was told by the chairman of the Rules Committee, of the Platform Committee, that there had been agreement reached for a compromise which had the initials DR in it, Dean Rusk obviously. Johnson wouldn't take that. He wanted to have a strong resolution, and that's what upset the whole campaign. Remember, it was put to a vote, and he got 60% support, but there was 40% opposition. And of course, that's what beat Humphrey. If Johnson had accepted this compromise resolution, which had been accepted by all the leaders, why he would have swamped through. Remember, Humphrey was very much in the polls, very much ahead before the convention, and then he was behind afterwards. But he began to pick up again, and remember, he wasn't beaten by very much. So that the Vietnamese War was the key to it. Unfortunately, Humphrey was in the position, he needed the money from Texas, which Johnson controlled. Money was very hard to get, and he didn't want to have Johnson come out against him. I don't know what Johnson's feelings were. He had very great emotion about the war, but I've told you about his feelings about the war and about the Great Society. It was a great tragedy that Johnson got involved in this war, because his Great Society program was one of the finest programs that any president has presented.
I wonder if you can go back and elaborate, because you haven't spoken on the camera, about what you thought Johnson's attitudes towards the war were.
Well, we've covered that by a good many of the questions that we've already discussed, but summing it up, my belief was that his principal interest in life was the Great Society, and he had been an admirer of President Johnson when he came, of President Roosevelt, and he wanted to complete the unfinished business of the New Deal and develop some of his own ideas in making our country great, and develop all of the programs that were so necessary. The civil rights program, the educational program he was most proud of, and so forth. But he inherited this war, and unfortunately, he didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know much about it. He hadn't had much to do with it. And he was advised by some of his friends that they're in this situation. No president has ever lost a war. You can't afford to lose a war. And then he had a divided group of advisors within his administration. So that he was an unhappy man with this, and it was a great tragedy that he got involved in this war. He wanted to stop it, and yet he wanted to achieve the objectives of giving the South Vietnamese their protection, and he wanted to get out with honor.
Governor, let's go back and pick up from the earlier questions.
Yes.
And get back into chronology.
By the way, has either of you people got anything to say about what I've said so far?
No.
Okay, could we cut now and we'll change tapes?
Okay, give you a break. We're just going to change the tape.
I got a word back, I think one of the few rude telegrams I ever got from the State Department. They said, your job is in Europe, not in the Far East. Well, the facts were that Atchison didn't know anything about the Far East, or very little. He was trying to butter up the French at that time to get them to accept an arrangement by which the Germans could enter into the defense of Europe. And he wanted to get their goodwill, and he didn't want to raise this issue. So I was against this war as far back as, on the record, as far back as '49.
What was President Truman's attitude towards the French war in Indochina?
Well, immediately after the attack in Korea, he wanted to strengthen all the situations, because he didn't know who.
Governor Harriman, you were close to President Roosevelt during World War II. What was his attitude toward the future of Indochina?
Well, I talked to President Roosevelt or rather, I was present when President Roosevelt talked about Indochina on several occasions, and one of the most dramatic was when he talked to Stalin about it at Tehran. He indicated that he didn't think the French should be allowed to go back into Indochina, and Stalin heartily approved of that. And then Roosevelt suggested that there be a trusteeship of the United Nations. Stalin didn't comment on that. He did, however, at Tehran agree to the United Nations, which is a great breakthrough. But on other occasions, he mentioned the fact he thought the French had done nothing for the Indochinese, and that they shouldn't be allowed to go back. In fact, he sent word to the Pentagon. Hank Byrode, Colonel Byrode, who was in the Army and then later on ambassador, told me that he had been a staff officer and he saw a message come from Roosevelt to the Army that they should not have anything to do with the surrender of the Japanese in Indochina. But he never left any word with the State Department, so no one understood just what his ideas were.
What do you think Churchill's attitude was towards the situation in Indochina?
Well, he didn't talk with Churchill about it because, of course, Churchill had made it very plain he wasn't for a forced breakup of the empires. His views wouldn't have fitted in. But this was an understanding between Roosevelt and Stalin.
You were the head of the Marshall Plan in Europe during the early 1950s. At that time, we were giving aid to France, and France was fighting in Indochina. Were the French diverting American economic aid to Indochina?
Well, they were diverting their aid. I was in Paris in 48 through mid-50 until we had the Korean War, and I came back as an special assistant to President Truman. But I was quite unhappy about the fact that much of the aid that we were giving France was diverted towards this war in Indochina, and knowing the Roosevelt position and having accepted that as wise, I took up with Atchison, who was then Secretary of State, that we should, I think it must have been 49, that we ought to slow down on helping the French and get them to reduce their commitments there. If you say it, if you talk to Churchill, I said no. Churchill was for the maintenance of the empires.
Well, you might say that. Might be worth saying, even though you didn't hear him say it. Okay?
Well, why not say Churchill was not in sympathy in breaking up the empires?
Okay. We'll say it any way you want.
All right, Stan, first question.
You ready? Okay, we're rolling now.
Okay.